Welcome to Hockey Whiz Talks podcast. In this podcast, I talk about the history and evolution of pro players at the Olympics. The story of professional hockey players at the Olympics is really a story about how the game shifted from a strict amateur ideal to a modern showcase of the world's best talent. The evolution unfolds in distinct phases, each shaped by politics, league priorities, and the changing definition of amateur. Ice hockey debuted at the 1920 Summer Olympics and moved permanently to the 2024 Winter Games. The Olympics were originally explicitly for amateurs, which meant NHL players were barred. However, amateur ideal was uneven. Eastern Bloc nations fielded full-time amateurs who were effectively professionals supported by the state, while Western nations relied on true amateurs, creating a competitive imbalance. This tension set the stage for future changes. Ice hockey entered the Olympics in 1920 under the strict amateur code that governed all Olympic sport. NHL players were automatically excluded. National teams were often built from amateur clubs, university players, or military teams. Canada dominated early because its amateur system was deep and competitive. The US and European teams lagged behind, but gradually built stronger amateur programs. The Olympics were seen as a celebration of the sport untamed by money, a romantic ideal that was already starting to crack. Between the 1950s and 1970s is where the amateur era becomes historically complicated and honestly dramatically unfair. Eastern Bloc amateurs, countries like Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany fielded players who were full-time athletes paid by the state and technically listed as soldiers or factory workers, though they trained year-round and lived like professionals but were classified as amateurs because their salaries were not tied to a club contract. Western nations' true amateurs, like Canada and the US, were sending university players, senior A amateurs, and club players with day jobs. The result was a structural imbalance. The Soviets were not cheating. They were exploiting the letter of the amateur rule while ignoring its spirit. By the 1960s, the USSR became the dominant force in Olympic hockey, winning the 1964, 1968, 1972, and 1976 gold medals. Their success exposed the hypocrisy of the amateur system and fueled calls for reform. As global hockey professionalized, the amateur rule became increasingly outdated. The IOC gradually relaxed restrictions, allowing more experienced players, but NHL players still did not participate. The Olympics remained a showcase for college players, European pros, and state-sponsored players. If the pure amateur era was defined by idealism and imbalance, the next phase, roughly the 1970s through the early 1990s, is defined by contradiction. This is where the Olympic model began to break under the weight of reality, and every major hockey nation started bending, stretching, and outright ignoring the old rules. By the 1970s, hockey had changed drastically. The NHL was expanding, the WHA emerged, throwing money at stars. European leagues were openly professionalizing, and the Soviet system was already functioning professionally. Yet the Olympics still clung to the amateur rule. The gap between the rulebook and reality widened every year. The Eastern Bloc advantages became impossible to ignore. The USSR and Czechoslovakia were still calling their players amateurs, but by now everyone knew the truth. They trained full-time, they were paid by the state, and they had access to elite coaching, facilities, and year-round competition. Western nations increasingly felt the system was rigged. Canada in particular grew frustrated, not because the Soviets were cheating, but the definition of amateur became meaningless. Canada pulled out of the Olympics and World Championship competition for several years, arguing that the amateur rule was being applied unevenly. They wanted to use their best players, many of whom were in the NHL. The IHF refused, and Canada walked away. This was a symbolic rupture, the first major hockey nation to openly challenge the amateur system. And now a word from our sponsor. Check out my scouting blog at hockeywiz777scouting.com. Listen to my scouting blog podcast on podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/hockeywiz777scouting. The IHF slowly accepted that the sport was changing. European professionals were allowed into world championships, though the Olympics remained stricter, but walls were cracking. By the mid-1980s, many national teams were quietly using professionals in everything but name, and the amateur rule was becoming a relic. The US victory over the Soviets in 1980 was a miracle precisely because of the imbalance was so stark. A team of American college amateurs defeating the most dominant amateur team in the world, who were in practice full-time professionals, was inspirational but also highlighted the obscurity of the system. The world wanted best-on-best hockey, not philosophical gymnastics. The final blow came from outside hockey. The IOC began allowing professionals in other sports. Tennis, basketball, and soccer all embraced pros, and the NHL was now the only major league still excluded. By the early 1990s, the amateur rule was effectively dead. The only question left was when the NHL would be able to join the Olympics. By the early 1990s, the amateur rule was effectively dead everywhere except the Olympics. The IOC had already allowed pros in basketball, the 1992 Dream Team. Tennis, soccer, and other sports had modernized, and the IIHF had wanted the Olympics to reflect the global hierarchy of hockey. Fans wanted to see Gretzky, Lemieux, Yager, Hasek, Forsberg, and Yzerman in national colors. The NHL was the last barrier, and the league knew it. The breakthrough came when the NHL, NHLPA, IIHF, and IOC agreed to pause the NHL season for 2 weeks, release the players to their national team, and allow full NHL participation for the first time in history. This was a massive logistical sacrifice for the NHL, but the global exposure was too valuable to ignore. The 1998 Nagano Olympics was the first true best-on-best Olympics. This tournament changed everything. Every major hockey nation brought its full NHL roster. The world saw matchups that had never been possible before. The tournament became a showcase of pure skill, speed, and national pride. Key storylines included Dominik Hasek delivering one of the best goaltending performances ever, leading the Czech Republic to a gold medal. Canada bringing a stacked roster but falling short in a shootout to Czechia. The USA struggling and infamously trashing their dorm rooms. And Russia and Finland delivering a classic performance. Nagano proved that Olympic hockey could be the pinnacle of the sport. At the 2002 Salt Lake City Games, the NHL era found its rhythm. This is where the NHL era truly solidified. Canada won its first gold in 50 years, the USA won silver on home ice, and the women's tournament delivered the first great Canada-USA rivalry chapter. The NHL Olympic partnership now felt permanent. 2006, 2010, and 2014 were the golden age of best-on-best hockey. These tournaments cemented the NHL era as the definitive modern chapter of Olympic hockey. At the 2006 Turin Games, Sweden won gold with a perfectly balanced roster. The Forsberg, Mats Sundin, and Niklas Lidström generation gets its crowning moment at this Games. The 2010 Vancouver Games was the most watched hockey game in modern history. Crosby's golden goal becomes an instant cultural artifact. The US nearly pulled off a miracle of its own, with Zach Parise tying the game late in the third period to send the game to overtime. The 2014 Sochi Games, Canada delivers the most dominant defensive performance in Olympic history, a tactical masterpiece from start to finish. This 16-year stretch is widely considered the highest level of international hockey ever played. The NHL era matters because it transformed Olympic hockey from a philosophical debate into a global spectacle. It's truly best-on-best competition with iconic moments that define generations, a united global hockey calendar, and a new standard for international play. The NHL era did not just elevate the Olympics, it redefined what international hockey could be. Check out my hockey blog at hockeywiztalkshockey.blogspot.com. Follow me on Facebook and Instagram at hockeywiz777. NHL players did not participate in Pyeongchang 2018 due to league and IOC disagreements over cost and scheduling. They were expected to return for 22 Beijing Games, but due to COVID-19 disruptions, it forced the NHL to cancel its Olympic break again, keeping players at home. These two absences revived the feel of pre-1998 era with rosters built from European leagues, college players, and minor league pros. The 2026 Milan Cortina Olympics marked the first time since 2014 that every country is bringing their best players, with NHL stars fully cleared to participate. Media coverage emphasized the significance of this return after a 12-year absence from Olympic ice. Teams like Canada, the US, Sweden, and Finland are once again fielding rosters stacked with NHL talent, restoring the best-on-best format. The shift from amateurism to professionalism reflects the broader changes in the global sport. The collapse of the amateur ideal, the rise of commercialized league-driven hockey, the desire for best-on-best international competition, and the logistical and financial realities of NHL scheduling. The 26 games represent a full circle moment, with the world's best players back and the Olympic tournament once again resembling the pinnacle of international hockey. I'm going to be talking about surprises and disappointments at the 2026 Winter Olympics.